Hello, my name is Brene Davy, and today I will be presenting the trajectory theory and classifying juveniles. And so, classifying delinquency is not easy, but theories do make it easier. The theory that I will be talking about today is the trajectory theory, and for the trajectory theory, there are multiple paths to a delinquent career, and the offenders are often placed into different types and classes. And so the trajectory theory basically shows that there are multiple ways for delinquents to fall into delinquent behavior. It's not just a one-way street. And the theory that this paper that I decided to do my presentation on is about uses the Moffitt's developmental taxonomy of antisocial behavior. And for this, it's divided into two categories. It's for those who offending behavior is only adolescence limited, meaning that it only stops once the person ages out, like once they become an adult or 18. And the second category is for those who are consistent in committing crimes over their life course. So even after they reach like adulthood and they're out of their adolescence, they still participate in these behaviors. And this taxonomy also use snares and situational traps, basically saying that if they have situational traps available, that the adolescents will fall into delinquent behavior more often. And so these types of snares include dropping out of school or having substance abuse. And so there are three main categories of factors that this study uses. You have the demographic factors. You have age, race, parent education, marital status of parents, the father's crime, and processing. And these are all variables that fall under this category. And so the age is basically how old the participant was at the time that the study started. You have the race, which is what was the race of the individual. You have the parent's education, so it's what the parent's highest level of education was, whether it was college or just a high school diploma. Then you have the marital status of the parents, whether or not their biological parents were still married or if they were divorced, things like that. Then you have the father's crime, whether or not the father committed a crime prior to the juvenile's arrest. And then you have the processing, which means that whether or not the juvenile was formally processed through the court systems or informally processed through like a delinquency program or through the juvenile justice system, things like that. And then you have the social and contextual factors. The variables under this category include the maternal relationships, peer delinquency, neighborhood conditions, and exposure to violence. The maternal relationship is describing how warm or hostile the participant's relationship was with their mother, whether or not it was a loving and caring relationship, or if the mother was violent and hostile to the child. Then you have peer delinquency. This is stating whether or not they have friends who participate in delinquent behavior. You have neighborhood conditions, whether or not they see adults fighting or having cigarettes or graffiti or people doing drugs, and in their neighborhood is a common occurrence or not. Then you have the exposure to violence, and this is whether or not they have participated or seen violence. So whether or not they themselves have attacked or chased somebody, or if they themselves have been chased or attacked by somebody else. And so the last category is individual factors. You have the variables under this are physical aggression, impulse control, and substance use. The physical aggression is how proactive or reactive they are to physical aggression, whether or not they get aggressive with people to get something that they want or to get back at somebody, things like that. Then you have impulse control, how they would respond differently to certain situations, like if they would attack somebody back, things like that. And this was done in a survey. Then you have substance use, how often they typically use alcohol, marijuana, and other drugs, maybe like cocaine, different things like that. Now we have the sample size. The sample size was taken from Orange County, California, Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And then you have the race demographics that they came from, which are black, white, Hispanic, biracial, and or other. And here's a chart representing the race percentage. Now, the risk of the methods that they used in this research is the fact that most of the information came from self-reported surveys. The participants may or may not understand the questions that people are asking them, or they may over or underreport on the questions. Like, they may not admit that they tried to attack somebody because they think that maybe they'll get rearrested for something else or have another charge against them, things like that. And then the fact that this is a longitudinal study, meaning that the individuals may not or cannot continue to participate in the study. But for this specific study, there's an 86.6 retention rate, meaning that a majority of the participants did come back to continue the study. And so for the grouping, there were 4 groups that they was able to divide the participants in at the end of the study. There was the stable low group, the short-term recidivist, the escalating, and persistent groups. The stable low means that the participants had an incredibly low probability of reoffending throughout the study, and this was 55% of the participants. You have short-term recidivism. They had a high probability of reoffending during the first 2 years after their arrest, but after 2.5 years, that probability began to decline. You have the escalating, which means that their probability gradually increased over time. And then for the persistent, they had a high probability of reoffending throughout the study, and this was only 7%. So the results of this study, they found out that people who went through the process informally were more likely to be in the stable low group, meaning they were less likely to reoffend. And so since they didn't have to go through the formal court process, they didn't have that many interactions with like judges, lawyers, all of those different things. And so they didn't have that experience or have a negative experience with that. And so also first-time offenders had a higher probability of being placed in the stable low group because it's their first offense. You know, they probably won't do it again. And then you have the escalating group. They used more marijuana, engaged in more physical aggression, and had more environmental risk than the other groups. And so this shows that because they were more exposed to different situational traps, like the Moffitt's developmental taxonomy of antisocial behavior suggests, they're more likely to fall back into delinquent behaviors because they are surrounded by those different things. And surprisingly for this study, they say that race did not have a impact on how the groups were determined. And so for this study, I believe that it could be generalized for the male juvenile population, and that's because the sample size reflected the overrepresentation of minorities in the juvenile justice system, and it consisted of boys 13 and 17 years old at the time of the study, but they did not include any girls. So since there was no women representation in this study, I don't believe it'll be able to be generalized for the female population of the juvenile justice system, but it can be generalized for the male population. Also, since the sample came from heavily populated areas, I believe that it cannot be generalized for areas who have a lower population sizes because the results may be different. So thank you for this watching this presentation. Have a great day. Thank you.